As I'm preparing for my move to the US, I came across an article saying that the Toronto-Waterloo tech workforce is expected to surpass Silicon Valley in 2023. So that makes me question, did I make the right choice or not? For the short term, financially it seems like wages are a lot higher in Silicon Valley versus Canada. But over the next 5 to 10 year period, who knows, that could change. If tech companies in Toronto get big enough, like we saw with Shopify about a year ago, although they've dropped recently. But nonetheless, if the whole ecosystem continues to grow over the next 5 to 10 years, that will attract a lot more venture capital and overall attract a lot more technology talent. And if the inflow of talent increases faster than the inflow of money, then we could see an increase in wages significantly for workers here in the Toronto-Waterloo corridor. So we'll explore all the different factors that are going to contribute to the technology growth in Canada over the next few years. And hopefully, this information can be useful to you as you're doing your research on whether to invest in Canadian technology companies or not. One of the factors that I alluded to earlier in this video is the fact that Canadian wages are lower than those wages in the US, and this is beneficial to companies. This means companies pay lower wages for these tech workers, and assuming the quality is somewhat similar, then they're getting a better deal. And the reason why tech workers here in Canada will accept that lower wage is because the cost of living is lower here versus other major cities where technology is booming in the US. If we compare New York City or San Francisco with the cost of living in Toronto, well, it's no competition there. Those two American cities are more expensive than Toronto. And therefore, these Toronto companies are able to acquire talent at a lower cost. This is one of the main reasons why technology companies might choose to stay here in Canada versus deciding to move their home base over to the US. Reason number 2 that Canada could become a major technology hub is because of its favorable immigration policies. Over the past decade, as Justin Trudeau has taken over Parliament, we've seen an increase in immigration. And a good portion of these immigrants are actually technology workers. There's a large influx of immigrants from India or China because they see the salary, even though it's lower than the States, but it's still significantly higher than back at home. And the standard of living here in Canada is probably higher than where they are from originally. So these immigrant tech workers see an opportunity to make a better life for their families, and therefore they choose to come over here to Canada and work. And not only are workers coming in, we also have a huge influx of students. There's been a whole industry that's been built around getting students from overseas to apply to universities in Canada. Take, for example, Applyboard, which is a unicorn company based in my hometown, Waterloo. Their whole business is helping people from overseas apply for universities in various countries, like in Europe, USA, or Canada. So it's clear that immigrants are looking for ways to move into North America, not only because of the standard of living, but it's also the higher wages versus back at home. And as the tech workforce in Toronto and Waterloo continues to increase, this is only going to attract more companies to set up shop here in this corridor. We've already seen companies like Amazon and Facebook set up headquarters in Toronto. And as well as I noticed recently in Waterloo, I think this is 2 years ago, Apple started having job postings that are tech related in Waterloo itself. So clearly, big tech notices this pool of talent in Toronto and Waterloo, and they want to tap into it. Now, looking at the article which states that the Toronto-Waterloo tech force is expected to surpass Silicon Valley in 2023, their reasons are the following. We are growing 350% faster than Silicon Valley, says Chris Albinson, Chief Executive Officer at Communitech in Kitchener. So right off the bat, that seems like a very intriguing statement here. So let's dive further into the article. The first part here talks about a story from a person from India immigrating over to Canada, saying that it was easier than... The first part here talks about a story from a person who originated from India. They were working in UK but found it a lot easier to get a visa in Canada, and that allows their parents to also stay here in Canada, which is a bonus. They contrasted that with the difficult immigration that the US has. Then after that story, they get right into the stats. In 2021, when the pandemic was happening, the Bay Area only added 14,000 jobs. And then if we compare that to the Toronto-Waterloo corridor, they added 88,000 jobs, meaning that's probably where they got their 350% value from at the beginning of the article. Another stat they pulled here is that Canada admitted 400,000 new immigrants during the last 12 months, half of them with STEM degrees. So it seems like half the immigrants, which is 200,000 people coming into Canada, have a STEM degree, and these are high-valued workers. Now there's another opinion piece written by a venture capitalist who went to Silicon Valley and came back, and he gave these reasons during the middle of the pandemic why he believes that Canada will be the next Silicon Valley, or at least have a Silicon Valley-like presence in the world. This piece, published in the Globe and Mail, was back from 2021. Is Canada in line to be the next Silicon Valley? Chris Albenson was the person who wrote this article, and he was a venture capitalist who was based in California for the past 20 years. And he ended up moving back to Canada, and here are his reasons why. So first, he talks about Boston. It was the world's leading innovation region as recent as the early 90s, but it became rigid and uncompetitive. Silicon Valley surges into top spot, but is now facing the same issues as Boston did. So maybe Silicon Valley is at its peak, and history sometimes does repeat itself. So this leaves Canada, and specifically Ontario, perfectly positioned to come out on top. So why does he think it's perfectly positioned? In 2016, he interviewed a well-known Valley venture partner in front of an audience of Canadian entrepreneurs. The investor flatly told the assembled founders it was impossible to build a company worth $1 billion, let alone one that could generate $1 billion in annual revenue in Canada. And now in 2021, which is 5 years later, Shopify has reached a market capitalization of $167 billion, just behind Canada's biggest company, RBC, and we know, looking at history, they actually passed the valuation of RBC. Wealthsimple just hit $5 billion in valuation after raising $750 million growth round. Clearco, valued at $2 billion. Nuvei, with a trailing revenue of $375 million, has a market cap of $10 billion. And Lightspeed set initial public offering at $2.2 billion. These are all 2021 numbers, just remember that. Nuvei is no longer valued at $10 billion, but they're at $6.45 billion, still over the $1 billion mark. Looking at Lightspeed, they IPO'd at $2.2 billion. Well, they're at $3.21 billion, still above their original IPO price. But if you zoom out, not by much though, about 12%. There are a few other companies that he names down here: Applyboard, Fair, Ada Support, 1Password, Clio, PointClickCare, Simond, Covey, Hootsuite, and D2L. They have all raised more than $1 million, and likely valuations are north of $1 billion. So within 5 years, the landscape in Canada has significantly changed, and we can see here there's probably at least 10 companies that are technology focused in Canada valued over $1 billion. There's another fact that he brings, not much substance to it, but in terms of return on invested capital, Canada is now the third most productive tech ecosystem on the planet after Silicon Valley and China. It is closing the gap as those two rivals turn inward and stagnate. So it seems like Chris Albenson is super bullish on Canada versus Silicon Valley and China. Just note that some of his reasons didn't really age well as the stock market has crashed, while specifically technology has crashed, and some of the valuations and stuff that he gave in this article been dropped down because of the downturn in the market. Now, I've only presented one side of the story, but let's talk about the other side of the story where tech companies are actually hindered a little bit in Canada right now. Before we get into that, let's talk about today's sponsor, Cantech Letter. Cantech Letter is a website that I use for getting a second opinion while researching technology stocks. They are a site that will often have articles on smaller and up-and-coming companies, but also cover many of the mainstream Canadian and American tech stocks. They offer a free newsletter that will be sent to your mailbox so that you can stay informed about what's happening in the technology scene. Head over to the website and sign up today. Now, 4 things that are working against Canada and its tech scene. The first one being taxes. Income taxes and business taxes are less favorable in Canada versus over the United States, pretty much everywhere you go. Comparing taxes here in Canada versus California, I calculated the difference is like 5 to 7%, which can be significant if your salary is, let's say, $100,000. That's about $5,000 to $7,000 over the year. Reason number 2 against Canada is the weather. Right now, I'm filming this in a snowstorm outside, and there's actually lightning. And I think as an immigrant who came from, let's say, India or China, where you're used to no snow at all, snow might be a bit of a shock and also significantly colder for you. And generally, people don't like to be cold, even myself as a Canadian. I would prefer to be in like a mild weather, for example, like in Vancouver or in California, where temperatures never really drop below 0. But here you get snow dumped on you, you've got to shovel it, and you've got to de-ice it, and you've got to drive through it all. So this can be a major inconvenience, and oftentimes immigrant workers might realize that, hey, maybe let's move to the States, go a little bit further down south so that we get to avoid that snow. Reason number 3 against Canada is lower wages. So let's say you're an immigrant worker who has an offer from New York or Silicon Valley versus an offer from Toronto. You likely will look at the dollar values and realize that you're making a lot more in the US versus in Canada. So if the company can sponsor you and get you a visa in the States, you're more likely to go there. And I forgot to mention a reason earlier that's a pro for Canada. In the news, it seems like US is a lot more hostile towards immigrants versus Canada. Canada seems like a very accepting place, where US seems like a very racist place, at least according to the news sites. I don't know if I really believe that because there's a lot of immigrants in Silicon Valley. I mean, immigrant talent is some of the hardest working talent out there. So I really don't think it's that racist, but I'll let you know when I get down to the States. Finally, the last reason against Canada is the investment scene. I mean, I did mention that it's gonna probably grow, but that's not guaranteed. Right now, we still know there's a lot of money flowing into Silicon Valley because it's a tried and true places for generating billion-dollar startups. And that kind of lends as a flywheel to itself. As more billion-dollar startups get generated out of Silicon Valley, then more money flows into there. As an investor, why would you want to risk going to a new place if you know that's a tried and true place? Especially because there's a lot of accelerators there. For example, Y Combinator, they continue to increase their batches of startups that they're intaking. And I think that's going to really lend itself to continue to make Silicon Valley one of the top places to go. Only time will tell though if Silicon Valley starts slowing down and Canada continues to ramping up. For the short term, I do think that Silicon Valley is still a better place to invest in, but if I were forced gun pointed at my head, I would probably say in the long term, Canada will probably see a lot more growth than Silicon Valley. And that's mainly because Silicon Valley is already so large and they produce massive companies, versus Canada, the tech scene is only getting started. We just saw Shopify a year ago surpass Royal Bank, being the most valuable company on the TSX. So I think that shows potential for technology to really grow in Canada, and we can see these companies doubling or tripling over the next 10 years or so. That's because it's a lot easier to scale as a technology company versus finance companies or telecoms or mining companies. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below on which one you think will do better over the long term. Do you agree with my possible speculation that Canada will do better in the long term, we're talking 10 plus years, or do you think Silicon Valley will still do better? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and keep up the grind and have a great day.